Introduction. Too many people are trying to be something they're not, and this grinds them down. Too many of us try to pretend to be somebody that we're not. Maybe we're trying to impress people. Maybe we're trying to fool ourselves into thinking that we are completely different people. The sad part, too many of us are not aware that this is happening. It's just something that happens on autopilot. They keep pushing forward, but ultimately, it still doesn't measure up. Regardless of how hard they try, and regardless of how much effort they put in, they simply aren't happy, nor are they fulfilled. There's always something missing. They feel incomplete, flawed, and weak. Of course, this happens deep down inside, and oftentimes, they can't quite put their finger on it. They feel that something is missing, that something is off, but they fail to see the 800-pound elephant in the room. Similarly, too many people suffer from imposter syndrome. Regardless of the fact they actually know what they're doing and that they are quite competent in certain areas of their life, they still feel that they are giant frauds. They feel that they are in danger of somehow being found out. They feel this because they are under the impression that they must be perfect all the time. They feel that they must impress people all the time. What is the root cause of all of this? The idea of perfection. People might not be able to articulate this belief, but they definitely think and act like it. You don't necessarily have to know the concept or the proper name of what you're going through for you to go through some sort of process or suffer certain symptoms. Regardless, people are trapped living with this idea of perfection. Pro tip, you don't have to be perfect because no one is. The truth is, you can't be your best at all times. That's just not going to happen. You can't be all things to all people, nor can you have it all. Unfortunately, too many people think they have to be perfect because they expect themselves to be perfect. They are assuming that people expect them to be perfect, so they expect themselves to be perfect, and this creates a downward spiral. Also, too many of us think that this striving for perfection or the appearance of perfection are genuine sources of pride. Other people hang on to the emotional albatross of perfectionism because they think others are relying on them to be perfect. They think that other people cannot move on or live full lives until and unless they are perfect. This training teaches you how to get out of the long shadow of wanting to be perfect. Instead, it teaches you to achieve peace within by accepting yourself fully, flaws and all. 8 mindsets that crush personal contentment. The French Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously said that man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Of course, Rousseau meant this in political terms, but this is also true in spiritual and emotional terms. Most of the time, we hold the key to the mental prisons that we live in. We define the world in neat, tidy little boxes that spell out what we can and cannot do, who we can and cannot be, and where we can and cannot go. Almost all of this is arbitrary, but they are all too real because we make them real by believing in them. We were born free, but we refuse to turn the lock of the mental prison that we choose to be in. And much of this situation can be tied to 8 mindsets that work to hold us back and drag us down. Oftentimes, we're unaware that we have these mindsets. Still, the sooner you get out from under the influence of these, the sooner you will live a life of adventure, meaning, fulfillment, and paradoxically enough, control. See if you can identify any of the following mindsets. Letting go of them prepares you to live life to your fullest potential. You have to always be in control. The first mindset that crushes personal contentment is the very idea that you must always be in control of all areas of your life. Now, it doesn't take much human experience to figure out just how wrong this is. You've heard of Murphy's Law. The worst things happen at the worst time. You probably also know that life is what happens when you have other plans. Life has its own agenda. It spins on its own axis, regardless of our best laid plans. And, unfortunately, the more we choose to believe that we have to be always in control, the less likely we will be happy. You see, when it comes to life, you have to give it a lot of wiggle room. You can set goals, you can plan ahead, but ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to accept what you get out of the process. 9 times out of 10, if you take care of things the right way and you put in the best effort, things will pan out roughly the way you want it. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to fit the exact picture that you had when you were planning your goal, but it can come close enough. Unfortunately, if we believe that we always have to be in control, we rob ourselves of the joy of achievement. We can never quite seem to get there because we feel that we did not control all the variables. We refuse to be happy. Everyone cares about what's going on in your life. Another debilitating mindset that holds people back is the idea that the world is a stage and they are at the center of the spotlight. I don't know how to tell you this, but there are 8 billion people on this planet, and the number is continuing to grow. Everybody's got enough problems of their own. While it may seem that everybody makes a big deal of your shortcomings and personal drama, at the end of the day, they don't really care. They've got too much on their plate already. Still, we would like to believe that everyone cares about what's going on in our life. It's as if we're in a microscope. What we're really doing is we are mentally putting ourselves in the center of the universe, which is the farthest place from where we really are. It gives us a sense of control. It definitely gives us a sense of importance. But the problem is, the more you believe that everyone cares about what's going on in your life, the more likely you will try to live your life to please others. This is a serious problem because you have to live your life based on what matters to you. Of course, this has limits. You can't live your life to harm other people. You can't live your life in a way that other people are hurt. But at the end of the day, you have to live your life for yourself. You have to take care of yourself. Self-care is the foundation of responsibility. Unfortunately, the more we hang on to this distorted belief that people really care about what's going on in our lives and look to us as some sort of center of gravity, the more likely we would live our lives to please other people or to live up to impossible standards. Everyone looks up to you for support or as a standard. This mindset is just a variation of what I discussed immediately above. You have to understand that people have enough problems of their own. While people can voice their support and express their admiration of you, at the end of the day, their standard has to be themselves because that's what they're going to come back to. At the end of a person's life, I can guarantee you that they're not going to be thinking about how they lived up to somebody else. Instead, they're going to be examining the kind of life they actually lived. It all comes back to that point. We all have a home, whether we accept it or not. Unfortunately, when we believe that everybody looks up to us, either for assistance or to set us up as some sort of standard, then we end up playing all sorts of games with ourselves where we often create standards that are meant to impress others, but are not really rooted in who we are. Again, living your life for others is commendable. To a certain degree, it's praiseworthy. But at the end of the day, you still have to take care of yourself. You still have to base your life on truth. And one of the worst lies you can play on yourself is to think that you are some sort of standard, not because the standard truly comes from your experiences and your values, but because you want to impress other people. You lose sight of the truth trying to become the truth to others. It's paradoxical and, ultimately, destructive. Your parents and loved ones will not be happy if you are not perfect. Human beings have a tendency of blowing things out of proportion. This, of course, comes from the fact that we tend to read too much into the signals that people give us. Every single day, people are saying stuff to us. They're definitely sending all sorts of verbal and nonverbal signals. We interpret these. That's what we constantly do. But we get into trouble when we read meaning into them that is not logical. We stretch the rational meaning that we can possibly read into something. It's not uncommon for people to look at reality based solely on what they think is real. In other words, they're not looking at objective truth. Instead, they're protecting their own insecurities, inadequacies, or misconceptions. Unfortunately, one of the most common ways we do this is when we think that the people who love us the most in this world expect us to be perfect. It may be based on some sort of objective statement, but we blow it out of proportion. We stretch it to the point that it breaks, and it breaks away totally from reality. You have to understand that your parents expect the best from you because they want you to live the best life. But they also are adult enough to understand that ultimately, you have to find your own way. All of us have to do that. Unfortunately, this is very easy to distort into a sick sense of obligation. We read this as a demand for perfection. It's very easy to see why this takes place in the first place because when you're a kid, your parents have standards. An A is an A, and an F is a failing grade. Objective standards. And it is an important part of your development as a human being to know how these standards work. But somewhere along the way, you confuse the existence of standards with this exaggerated sense of obligation that you have to be perfect. Let me tell you, it would be unreasonable and downright cruel of your parents to expect you to be perfect when they are not perfect themselves. The truth is, there is no such thing as a perfect human being. We are in no position to expect perfection from others when we ourselves are not perfect. But unfortunately, all of this is lost to you if you suffer from this mindset. Instead, you read into the signals that you're receiving from your parents and the ones that you truly admire and respect the most in this life as a call to perfection. It first starts out as having a standard, but it gets twisted and exaggerated into something that oppresses you. Believe it or not, standards are supposed to push you upward and outward. They are what make you successful. They are what make you a better person. But they have limits, and we cannot read into them all sorts of insecurities that they become shackles. And that's precisely what happens to people who think that everyone else looks up to them for support or some sort of standard, or that loved ones will not be happy if they're not perfect. You always have to be better than others. Another debilitating mindset that people suffer from is the idea that they always have to be better. This is going to be impossible because all of us are a mix of peaks and valleys. Seriously, even Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, the world's richest man, is flawed, limited, and lacking in some areas of their life. If you don't believe me, just imagine Jeff Bezos comparing himself to Michael Jordan in terms of basketball skills. I know that's a ridiculous example, but that's precisely the point. You can't be all things to all people. You cannot be the perfect person because there is no such thing. There is no such animal. We all have angels and devils in our character. Bill Gates may be a great businessman. He may be a great innovator and an amazing philanthropist, but he's probably a lousy basketball player. The problem when you think that you always have to be better than others is that you have to beat everybody across the board. You have to be a better philanthropist. You have to be more compassionate. You have to be better looking. You have to be a better conversationalist. You have to be amazing on the basketball court, across the board. Do you see how impossible this is? Good. Let go of the mindset that you have to be better than others to allow yourself to feel fulfilled, complete, contented, and happy. It's just not going to happen. People care if you fail. This is a big one. This really flows from the mindset that everyone cares about what's going on in your life. So, when things fall apart and don't work out the way you anticipated or planned, you take it very personally. You feel less of a person. You feel like you have massively dropped the ball. Let me let you in on a secret. Everybody fails. People get divorced. People get thrown in jail. People do end up doing things that they shouldn't do. People make wrong decisions that mess up their life. Regardless of how you define it, everybody fails. Now, it's one thing to assume that people will have some level of concern for you when you're down on your luck. That's okay. That's healthy. That's the way it should be. That's why we have support networks. That's why we have loved ones like family and friends. But to take this to a ridiculous level and assume that people care and obsess about your failures is nothing less than a form of masochism. You're just beating yourself up. You have to understand that as spectacular as your bankruptcy, your divorce, your jail sentence, your disease, your depression, or sense of personal disaster may be, at the end of the day, everybody's got their own problems to take care of. Everybody's got their own personal failures to attend to. Sure, people might sit up and pay attention and say, "Wow, that is harsh," or "Thank goodness that did not happen to me." But at the end of the day, they move on. So should you. Unfortunately, the more you think that people are obsessed about your failure, the worse your failures become. How come? Well, you're less likely to try again. You get knocked down and you stay down because you're so afraid of how people will laugh at you and point at you because you failed. You create all these reasons and excuses not to try again. Let me tell you, the only way to fail is to quit, and that's precisely what you're doing. Happiness is a destination. One of the most toxic mindsets that can get in the way of any kind of personal contentment is the idea that happiness is some sort of destination. You find yourself working to set up goals, and once you achieve them, you're still not happy because you feel that you will only be happy if certain things fall into place. Well, life being the way it is will prevent this from happening. As awesome as things may be in your life, there will always be room for improvement. That's what makes life awesome. It's also what makes it frustrating because everything does not fall into place. There's no neatness to this. You just have to accept what you get at a certain level. In other words, you have to move on. But when you think that you will only be happy when certain things happen in your life, the more you work towards those goals, the more you realize that you can never be happy. Because once you work toward your goals, your definition of happiness or the destination that you set for yourself changes because the process changes you. Believe it or not, setting up a goal transforms your life because the work that you put in, the process that you go through, and most importantly, the setbacks that you experience change you. While all of this is going on, don't be surprised if your definition of happiness or your goals change as well. What other people think about you is more important than what you think about yourself. Finally, one mental shackle or pair of handcuffs that we need to get rid of is the idea that what people think of us is more important than what we think of ourselves. Let me tell you, at the end of the day, people have to be responsible for themselves. You have to be responsible for your own happiness, fulfillment, and contentment. And the more you think that the judgment of others trumps your own assessment of yourself, the less likely you will feel content because you're basically living your life for the approval and validation of others. At the end of the day, you're the one who's going to have to live your life, not them. You owe it to yourself to at least accept and be content with what you have set for yourself. This means accepting your decisions. And unfortunately, when we play this game with ourselves that other people's impressions, validations, or appreciation is more important than what we ourselves think about our lives, we put ourselves in a downward spiral. It really is a psychological and emotional pit. It gets worse and worse. The more we crave validation from others, the worse we feel about our decisions and our lives. Choosing to accept yourself is not a cop-out. This training teaches you the art of self-acceptance. Self-acceptance, after all, is crucial to personal contentment. If you want to be happy with the life that you have created for yourself, you have to accept yourself. There are no two ways about it. Personal contentment is definitely not going to happen until and unless you accept yourself, warts and all. Unfortunately, this does not come easy for most people. After all, we put up all sorts of barriers against self-acceptance. We don't intentionally put these up. It's not like you wake up one day and you decide to sabotage your personal happiness and your ability to experience joy. Instead, they kind of creep up on you. You pick them up along the way. Oftentimes, you don't know where they came from or what triggered them. Still, there is no getting around the fact that they hold you down and keep you back from fully accepting yourself. 3 of the most common reasons we give ourselves for not engaging in self-acceptance involve the following. Accepting yourself is a cop-out. One common mindset we assume about self-acceptance is that it's some sort of cop-out. You're not supposed to accept yourself. You're supposed to strive for a better you. Life is all about striving. It's all about struggling to rise up and become better, moment by moment, day by day. The moment you accept yourself, you're basically copping out. You're giving yourself a reason not to try to improve yourself. It is some sort of feel-good mantra that really doesn't mean much of anything. You are lowering your standards. Another barrier we put up against self-acceptance is the idea that this is an act of lowering the goalpost. Somehow, some way, you can't make it the normal way. You just don't have it in you. So you lower your standards when you accept yourself for who you are. You don't want to be something bigger. You don't want to be something better. So you lower the standards. This is a very toxic barrier against self-acceptance. Who wants to feel that we're not living up to high standards? Who wants to feel that one is constantly aiming low? So we forget about the idea of self-acceptance. Instead, we hang on to our standards, but they actually end up working against us. You are being weak and caving in. Another common reason people give themselves as to why they cannot accept themselves as they are is the idea of weakness. It's easy to think that there's something romantic and noble about being strong or trying to be strong. It's nice to see yourself fighting against this army of problems in life and just pushing back against all odds. That eventually, after all this struggle, strife, and sacrifice, you will come out on top. This is a nice romantic picture, but life usually doesn't end up that way because ultimately you run out of steam. Ultimately, you lose the battle because you're trying to be something that you're not. In fact, it is a sign of strength when you realize that you are worthy of acceptance. It is a sign of maturity, not some sort of personal defeat or weakness or inadequacy. Self-acceptance means understanding our limits. The truth is the world is limited. I know that's not what you're supposed to say. That's definitely not what you're supposed to believe. We're supposed to think that the world is limitless, that there's a tremendous sense of possibility out there, and we should live our lives with an amazing sense of adventure. Well, that's the idea. But reality is another matter entirely. Not everybody's given the same hand to play. Not everybody has made the right decisions. While it's true that we all start out with the same amount of potential as we live our lives, our decisions narrow that potential. This doesn't mean that you're completely out of opportunities, but this also does not mean that your life always has the same amount of potential as before. You have to understand these limits and work within them. You can push against them, you can choose to transform them, but there are limits to what you can do. Self-acceptance is all about understanding that limits exist and that they can be changed to a certain degree. It is the precise opposite of continuing to believe that you basically have a blank check in life. That's a lottery mindset. You're basically thinking that despite the habits that you picked up along the way, as well as the consequences of the decisions you've made, your chances of producing results are the same as everybody else. That may happen from time to time, kind of like winning the lottery, but it's usually a bad idea to plan your life around winning the lottery. You have to focus on what is probable. This is where understanding our limits comes in. Self-acceptance means choosing your base of strength and competency. I know, by this point, after our discussion regarding understanding limits, it's easy to get depressed. It's easy to get discouraged. Well, the truth can be quite discouraging and depressing at times, but it can also set you free. When you understand that limits do exist and that there is a context to these limits, you can then focus on what you have. You have to understand that having limits is not the same as having nothing to work with. Let's just get that clear. There are people on this planet that have severe physical limitations, no limbs, serious health problems. But despite those limits, they are able to achieve a lot. They're not able to achieve everything that everybody else is able to achieve, but they're able to achieve a lot. How come? Well, they look at their limits and they accept them. And in this process, they accept that they actually have a lot of strength and they can build a certain bedrock of competency. And from there, they can continue to build and build and build. What would otherwise look like a very bleak and limited set of prospects actually turn out to be a source of life, light, and happiness. But it all goes back to accepting and understanding your limits and choosing to base your strength and competency on the reality of those limits. The truth, limits can be transcended. The problem with our discussion is that a lot of people start with the end first. That's what they do. They focus on the fact that limits can be transcended. This was true in the past, this is true now, and will continue to be true in the future. But you cannot base your self-acceptance on this fact first. This comes last. You have to focus on first overcoming your reasons against self-acceptance. Once you're able to do that, then you have to understand your limits. Then choose to base your strength and competency on the reality of those limits. Then, and only then, can you start thinking about transcending those limits. It's really hard to transcend your limitations when you haven't built a base of strength and competency. Do you see how this works? Stop putting the cart before the horse. How does this work? Well, first, you have to accept your limits now. Next, you have to understand that growth means transcendence. In other words, you understand your limits, you work within them, you master what you can control, then you build up. The next step is to push back against the walls of your comfort zone once you have become competent. The key here is increasing competence. This is not something that happens to you because you willed it. You don't just wake up one day and all of a sudden this amazing competence level falls into your lap. It doesn't work that way. Instead, when you first start with the limitations and become at peace with those limitations, you start to focus on the things you can control. You start mastering them. They turn into your source of strength. You become more and more competent. And once you're able to do this, you can then push against the walls of your comfort zone. The goal is to become mature. Maturity is defined by how far you progressed from your base of strength and competency. In other words, you first understand your limits, and you start there. But your level of maturity is measured by how far you go from that initial understanding to where you end up. Everybody has to come to grips with the fact that they're all limited. We can't have it all, nor can we start with everything. But the moment we understand our limits, we can then start to build a base. Because as we push back against our comfort zone and we figure things out and we connect the dots and we detect patterns, that's when things become possible. We become stronger, more competent. We're able to solve more problems. And people come to us to solve their problems. Learn to move on. I've got some bad news. Life is unfair. Worse still, it has its own schedule. That's right. It has its own agenda. It's not going to wait around for you. It's just going to keep on keeping on. This is why you can't always get what you want when you want it. Accepting your flaws and allowing self-love to flower in your life and empower you requires learning to move on. Learn to accept what you can create and what you can influence and what you can't. Be at peace with this. The worst thing that you can do to yourself is to think of yourself as some sort of victim that the world owes all sorts of favors to. I've got some more bad news for you. The world doesn't owe you anything. Everybody's got enough problems of their own. Life truly is unfair, chaotic, and in many cases filled with all sorts of suffering. Now, you really have two choices at this point. You're more than welcome to beat yourself up as to why the world isn't what you think it should be. This path burns up a lot of time, effort, and energy, and oftentimes, you're more frustrated than you began and have very little to show for your efforts. The other path, of course, simply means acceptance. Accept that life isn't fair. People can be mean. Bad things happen to good people, and on it goes. Once you've accepted all of these, resolve to move on. This doesn't mean that life has defeated you. This doesn't mean that you have become some sort of cynic. Instead, this is a moment of learning. It's a moment of truth. You learn to accept what you can create and what you can influence. That's the best you can do. In other words, instead of feeling powerless because of all this chaos outside of you that you cannot really control, your eyes are now open to the things in your life that you can control, because there will always be at least a few areas in your life where you have a lot of say. Focus on those. That's how you move on. You move on by focusing on what you can create, control, or influence. You may not be able to control the economy, but you can control how hard you work. You may not be able to control whether your boss would be eager to promote, but you can control the value you bring to the table as far as work is concerned. Focus on what you can control or influence and then let go of everything else. This has a paradoxical effect because when you do that, you feel more empowered. This really should not be a surprise because you free up a lot of the emotional energy that you used to burn up, worrying about stuff that you can't control. You then redirect all that energy to the things you can take care of in the here and now. This is how you discover the freedom and joy in moving on. Conclusion. If you want to accept yourself, you have to do it now. Stop playing games with yourself. There will never be a perfect time where everything will fall into place. That is an illusion. In fact, that is an excuse you give yourself time and time again, so you don't have to start. I know that it's unpleasant. I know that you'll probably run into all sorts of truths you've been avoiding all this time, but that's precisely what makes all of this so urgent. You only have one life to live. Make it count. Make it count to that one person that truly matters in your life. That person, of course, is you. Start today. You owe it to yourself.